Hey everybody, Mr. Wallowitz here. We are going to use this format to uh, do our note-taking sessions. If you've had me in the past, you know that usually in class we'll project the notes on the PowerPoint um, on the screen. In front of the class, you'll have to copy down everything. Well, we're going to kind of change things up a little bit this year with the help of Screencastify, where we're not going to do notes in class. At least that is my hope. We are going to try to do notes through this so you can view it at your own time to prepare yourself for class, whether it is in class or virtual, so that we are not losing a day to doing notes. We can just continue to do the work that we need to do in the classroom. So our first lesson in United States History 2 honors will be about the labor movement and capital and labor. So we have a couple of vocabulary terms. I think we've got about 8 of them. First, we have strike, a refusal to work organized by a body of employees as a form of protest, typically in an attempt to gain concession or concessions from their employer. Capital is wealth in the form of money or other assets owned by a person or organization, or available or contributed for a particular purpose, such as starting a company or investing. Skilled work, any worker who has a special skill, training, knowledge, and ability in their work. Unskilled work is work that doesn't require you to exercise much, if any, judgment in order to perform the central job duties. We have capitalist, a wealthy person who uses money to invest in trade and industry for profit in accordance with the principles of capitalism. Labor union, an organized association of workers, often in a trade or profession, formed to protect and further their rights and interests. Populism, a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by the established elite groups. And socialism, a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. So a little background to the labor movement is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. So railroad workers went on strike for better wages and working conditions. Strikers were working very long hours, not being paid very much, so they went on strike to try to force the company owners' hand to give them better wages and shorter hours. Strikes were very peaceful until law enforcement and state militias were called in. After the arrival of law enforcement and state militias, the strikers then started to destroy engines, cars, depots in response, and strikes stretched from Baltimore to St. Louis. So this whole idea of protest, in the form of strike, and having it be put down by state militias, which would be the equivalent today of the National Guard, is nothing new. We have been seeing the protests in the various cities throughout our country, protesting police brutality in the Black Lives Matters movement, being put down by the National Guard, which would be like the state militia, being put down by law enforcement, and in some cases by federal troops. Nothing new. Company owners, the established elite, do not like when they are being challenged. So whenever they can, they try to what I like to call, quote unquote, keeping the peace by bringing in those to disrupt it. So when law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't put down the strikes, federal troops were called in. So again, nothing new that's going on today. These things are, types of things have been going on for hundreds of years. In the end, strikes were put down by federal troops, or because of federal troops. The put down of strikes convinced laborers of the need to form labor unions. They didn't, the put down of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, when it didn't get what it wanted, it didn't stop the laborers from wanting their goals. You know, they didn't want, they will still want to achieve their goals. They were just going to try to find a different way to do it. So now we have the march of capital. As industrialization evolved, so too did worker powerlessness. Long hours, dangerous working conditions, and low wages united workers in their quest to organize and challenge business owners. Mass production soared when workers were given one task as part of a process rather than completing the whole process, similar to that of an assembly line. So skilled workers, if you're a skilled worker, you know how to do a job to its completion. Well, what would happen was these the managers of the factories, the owners of the factories would see your process and break it down into smaller tasks so that they, instead of paying a skilled worker a lot of money to complete that task, they can now pay an unskilled worker or many unskilled workers a little bit amount of money just to do the same task over and over again, similar to that of an assembly line, where you have one piece done at a time in order to complete the full task at the end, like how we put cars together today. Products could be made faster with low-cost transportation. Companies made a ton of money. American companies quickly realized that the bigger the production, the bigger the profits. The more you can make, the more product you can make, the quicker you can sell it, the more money you are going to make in the end. Industrialization and mass production pushed American industry to the world's leader, to be the world's leader. For a couple, since I guess America's founding, it had struggled to keep up with the rest of the world, particularly countries in Europe, and even more specifically England. England was a major manufacturing giant in the world before the late 1800s, and because of industrialization and mass production, America overcame that, and America would be the world's leader. With companies emerging to reap the benefits of this production, competition followed. However, competition is bad for business. You don't want companies to compete with you. So what you try to do is eliminate your competition. And one way to do it is to merge companies. And so in a very short time, in less than a decade, 4,000 companies merged in one way or another. Companies would merge to have a better control over the market. And because of this, the companies, maybe there are 4,000 or so different companies, are now merged into 41 companies. Now think about how much they control. There's just a small piece of the American industrial population, and these are all just business owners. So really, it could be 41 people controlled 70% of the market, and monopolies had arrived. Now, monopoly is when one business dominates the entire market. What we started to see in the late 1800s, early 1900s was one company for oil, one company for steel, one company for railroads starting to dominate their respective markets. And that is considered no good. So with the rise of capital, with workers not making as much money as they once had, we have a rise in inequality. Capitalism ushered in enormous profits and unheard of fortunes. It also created millions of low-paid, unskilled, and unreliable jobs with long hours and dangerous conditions. This creates the so-called Gilded Age in America, where owners were extremely wealthy and laborers were really poor. So when historians would look back at this time and see the enormous amount of money America was making, the gross domestic product just soaring, and think, wow, that like this country, must be rich from top to bottom, and it really wasn't the case. Workers, laborers were making next to nothing, while the company owners were reaping all of the benefits. And by 1900, the richest 10% controlled 90% of the nation's wealth. So when you hear politicians, particularly like Bernie Sanders today, talk about how the top 1% or the top 0.1% have all this wealth. It kind of gets its start in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where companies are starting to consolidate themselves, merging into one another. So you have 41-ish different companies controlling the market, and that wealth is being concentrated in only a select few people. So 90% of all of the money that the nation has, as far as private capital, is only controlled by 10% of the entire American population. The belief in survival of the fittest came the idea that those at the top must get stronger. It also made those who were the elite at the time, the company owners, feel good about themselves. They started to express the idea that if you were wealthy or poor, it was because of choice. You made the choice to either become super wealthy or you made the choice to become poor. And it really, in reality, is not the case. Company owners wouldn't pay their laborers, they wouldn't pay their employees very well. So there is this, we have a lot of poor, a lot of company owners making millions of dollars while their employees are living below the poverty line. Capitalists soon looked to the pro-business Republican Party for support, as they were able to use their control of the federal government to shield American business from foreign competition. The Republican Party starts to become the pro-business, pro-capitalist party that it really still is today. It uses its strength after the Civil War to control who can make the money, protect businesses from their employees, so that and also to shield from foreign competition, raising the tariffs, taxing imported goods so that it costs more to buy a European product than it would to buy an American product. They use their power to make sure that you buy American and that American business owners were making as much money as possible. The labor movement. Many skilled laborers were forced to become unskilled laborers. In order to keep your job as a skilled laborer, if you still wanted to work for the company, you would just need to, or you'd be forced to take a pay cut, because it wouldn't pay you as much anymore to do a single task over and over again. So many skilled laborers taking a big pay cut to become unskilled laborers. Despite working 60 hours, their earnings fell well below the poverty line. Women and children were forced into the labor force to compensate. We have the men usually are the men of the household would be the ones who would go to work, husbands, fathers, and such, because they're being paid next to nothing. Cost of rent might be going up, utilities might be going up, your family is growing, so you need this or that. The cost of living goes up while your wages don't. So now women, children are forced into the labor force as well. There have been a push for better wages and working conditions since the end of the Civil War. This is nothing new, especially when it came to freed slaves. When they entered the workforce, they wanted to be paid just as well as anybody else. So a lot of former slaves would strike, would not strike, but also advocate for better wages, better working conditions, and then others who were whites who were in the same situation, getting paid next to nothing, working long hours, would join them in advocating for better wages, better working conditions. So by the late 1800s, around the turn of the century, union membership begins to rise. One of the first labor unions is the Knights of Labor. They welcome all laborers, including women, to join. The Knights of Labor envisioned a society that rewarded labor and not capital. It was their belief that the ones who are making the product should be paid, and be regarded as an elite rather than those who are making money off of the labor. The company owners couldn't make money if the laborers weren't producing the products, was their belief. So who should have better power? It should be the laborers. The laborer, the manufacturer should be the one who dictates terms. Capitalists started to bring in strike breakers to end strikes as quickly as possible by any means necessary. When strikes would occur, like we had discussed earlier, state militias, law enforcement, federal troops would be brought in, and it didn't matter how they broke strikes or tried to break the strikes. You had to do it. We need to go back to work. We can't lose, when workers go on strike, the company can't make money. So we've got to get these factories open as quickly as possible, put down the strike, put these people back to work. One of the most famous strikes was the Haymarket Square riot in Chicago, where laborers were protesting for an 8-hour workday. Police step in to break up the protest. As they step in to do it, a bomb goes off and kills 7 police officers. So in response, police fire back into the crowd, killing 4 people. Haymarket Square riot happened when laborers protested for an 8-hour workday. It did not help union support because of this incident with the bomb and the return fire from the police. That strikes were then started to become associated with radicalism. And we see this still today, again with the protests in the various cities against police brutality and for racial justice. Racial equality. People are still trying to denounce these protesters as radicals, as anarchists. And that really, it's not the case. Many union leaders saw politicians and the courts support capitalists by breaking strikes using force, and the labor movement led many Americans to denounce political corruption for enabling economic inequality. From about the turn of the century, about this time, even through today with the progressive movement that we see in the Democratic Party, with the various politicians, we will continue to see this through the Great Depression, through World War I, Great Depression, World War II, and post-World War II, the political corruption and how economic inequality comes from the top. Another labor union to come out of this too is the American Federation of Labor. They believe that they could coexist with capitalists by aiming for more practical gains instead of just trying to go gung-ho, striking, and demanding all these. Well, we're going to negotiate. We're going to work with the company owners, the capitalists, for practical gains. Let's get one thing at a time rather than it all at once. Strikers at a steel mill in Pennsylvania, Andrew Carnegie's steel mill, defeated strike breakers, but the governor of Pennsylvania called in militia and a strike was broken. Despite failures, strikes continued. Workers did not give up for their rights, what they believed. They wanted a shorter work day, better working conditions, as well as better pay. They just wanted to be paid a living wage. The cost of living was starting to get too much. So it didn't matter how many times a strike would be put down, laborers would continue to strike. They would continue to seek out their goals by any means necessary as well. The populist movement. We think about strikes and we think about the labor movement in terms of just the factory owners or the factory workers, I should say. And that's not really the case either. Farmers at this time were affected by industrialization. Farmers made up a majority of the American population in the late 1800s and were hit hard by industrialization. Commercialization of agriculture forced farmers to rely on bankers and railroads to get their crops to market, something that they weren't necessarily used to before the labor movement of the 1870s. Frustrated by this new economic system, farmers organized themselves into cooperatives. They called themselves the Farmers Alliance. They wanted to deal with the railroads, the merchants, the bankers in an organized manner. And they're eventually going to start what would become the Populist Party. Farmers Alliance believed in a cooperative commonwealth that would protect the interests of the many from the greed of the few. Believing neither political party, I'm talking about the Republicans or the Democrats, could address their needs, farmers started the People's Party by attracting members who were being left behind by Gilded Age politics. Populist popularity should have made them a political power, and especially when the economic depression hits in 1893, the People's Party popularity soared. Populist popularity should have made them a political force, if not for the Southerners who race-baited populists. When populists wanted to unite all, and they were very open to uniting whites and blacks at this time, Southerners turned away, and populists then started segregating their ranks, and the party soon fell out of favor. Southerners turned away, populists started to balk at that, started to either keep African Americans out of their party or segregate their ranks. And here you have a white populist group and a black populist group. This upset many within the movement because the mission of the Populist Party was to unite all for and a party for everyone. And if the Southerners were going to try to derail that, infighting within the populist movement falls out, and the party starts to crumble. Socialists. There was a real Socialist Party of America at one point in this country. The Socialist Party is led by Eugene Debs, and it picked up where the populists left off. The Socialists, just like the populists or the Farmers Alliance, they wanted a cooperative commonwealth where laborers and tenant farmers were paid a fair wage for their labor. Socialist Party of America was open to all, regardless of age, gender, class, ethnicity, religion. It did not matter. If you wanted to join, you could join. They welcomed everybody. The Socialist Party of America gained so much speed and momentum that they had 33 cities in America elect a socialist mayor. 2 socialists were also elected to the House of Representatives. So the Socialist Party was gaining a lot of momentum in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Another labor union, the Industrial Workers of the World, they are nicknamed Wobblies, welcomed all workers regardless of race or gender as well. Eventually, the socialists would try to take control over labor unions, and so the idea that all labor union members are socialists kind of gets its birth about this time. And that's nothing new. We still hear that today, why labor unions are so demonized in American society today, that there's going to be a socialist takeover. While, yes, socialists did lead political parties in the early labor movement, or labor unions, I should say, in the early labor movement, it's not really the case today. But despite having socialists elected to local, state, federal offices, disagreements within the party before World War I crumbled the party. Again, more infighting about how to support or not support World War I. And when we cover America's involvement in World War I, we will get into this. But this is the labor movement. It starts off with a push by workers to try to demand higher wages, better working conditions, and shorter hours. And eventually, with the work of labor unions, we do get better working conditions. So, lots of safety measures, as we're going to see over the next couple of weeks of instruction, going to start to see these gains. The weekend exists because of people in labor unions. The 8-hour workday exists because of those fighting for their rights in labor unions. Minimum wage exists because labor unions fought for it and eventually won. So thank you for watching this, and I will see you next time. Ciao.